I'm Rosalind Carita, and this is History and Heritage. And today we are at Fort Defiance, and I have a special guest, Mark Britton. Mark is a self-described history geek, so this should be a great show. We're going to learn about Civil War medicine. Stay with us.
Hi, this is the Restore. My name is Catherine Norbeck Daly, and I'm the manager here at the Habitat for Humanity Restore. Everything we sell in here is donated. All of the proceeds go to benefit the Habitat for Humanity homes. We take windows, doors, building supplies, cabinets, household goods, and we will pick up. The Restore is located in downtown Clarksville at 408 Madison Street, across from Madison Street United Methodist Church. The phone number is 645-4242. Call us to schedule your next donation pickup.
Here we are with Mark Britton, and you yourself told me that you were a self-described history geek.
I did.
And that you've been in love with history and science since you were in high school.
Pretty much all my life.
Yeah.
That's true.
Where are we today? I see all sorts of things that look a little scary. What year are we?
As far as time, we're probably somewhere in that 1860 to 1865 time frame.
Okay, so we're in the Civil War.
We're during the American Civil War. The things that you see here and the way that medicine was during the Civil War had not really changed for thousands of years. The principles that doctors believed, the way they understood medicine had been around since Roman times.
So, to give us a little perspective, we're pre-antibiotics.
Yes.
So, germ theory
does not exist.
Okay. So that, of course, impacted everything.
Sure it did.
Did doctors even wash their hands?
No.
Okay, so here we are, 1860. This is set up. I see some pretty dramatic instruments here. Are we on the battlefield, or where are we?
The role that I would play would have been a small town country doctor.
Okay.
Me being the age that I am, I would have been too old to go off to war, with the rest of the young men, and so I would have been left behind to care for the town and whatever. If we happened to be in close proximity to a battle, I would have perhaps been contracted by one of the armies to work as a contract surgeon or a contract physician. To care for, not necessarily, I would not be a military surgeon, but they would use me just for a few days or a few weeks.
Okay.
To handle the vast
trauma
and then the number of wounded that
Right.
would have been there.
So on a regular day then, all of this would have been something you would use in your hometown practice?
Yes, it would.
Okay.
Yes, it would.
Take us through some of this equipment and tell us a little bit about what you treated and how you, what kind of, what theories did they believe in?
Well, okay, let's start over here.
Okay.
The way that doctors understood the human body and medicine at this time, they still subscribed to something called the four-humor theory.
Okay.
And that was something that had been around for about 2,000 years, put forth, I think, originally by a Roman surgeon, Roman doctor by the name of Galen. Okay, and so things had just not changed in all this time. Of course, it was not correct, but that was medicine. And what we had was that in that four-humor theory, the doctor believed that you had four liquids in your body, four substances, and if you were ill, one of those four was out of balance.
Either too much or
too little.
Okay.
And they had black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood were the four.
Okay.
And everything that a doctor did, whether it was using drugs and medicines to doing surgery, was an attempt to restore the balance of those four humors.
Okay.
Okay.
So then diagnosis was based on how some symptom expressed itself, like coughing
Right.
would be the phlegm part.
Right. We would treat the symptom specifically.
Right. Not the disease.
Not the
but
disease.
And
We would
that's the
treat the
big
symptom.
difference, the really big difference in medicine today and then.
Yes.
Okay.
One of the there's a lot of big
Right,
differences.
right.
But one of the things, because these things, had not changed. Now, there were medicines that were prescribed that we know now are extremely toxic
Right.
to us. This pill here, this was one of the most prescribed medicines of the 19th century. This is what was called a blue mass pill,
Okay.
and its active ingredient was actually mercury.
Ah, okay. And now we would
never dream of taking mercury.
Oh, so what did they give, what humor did mercury treat?
Well, they treated all of them with it. You could go to the doctor, actually the doctor came to you in those days, and he would, these are imitations, by
Okay,
the way,
okay,
so you
okay.
don't have to wash your hands. If you complained of depression, if you complained of headaches, if you complained of kidney problems, pretty much anything, if you had a broken bone, they would have given you
Mercury.
this.
Wow.
And earaches, infectious. Now they didn't know what an infection was, mind you, but if you had pain in your ears or your throat or whatever, mercury, and it worked. And you say, well, how did that work? Well, it's toxic to us. It's also toxic to the microorganism that you had.
Okay.
But because they're smaller, they succumb first.
Okay.
And then you are better, so you quit taking the medication. Now,
So it was empiric.
yeah,
It worked, so it was good.
right. For some illnesses, the length of time that you had to take this was past the point where toxicity symptoms began to show. For mercury, which was excessive salivation, loosening of teeth, hair falling out, things like that. So, not really good side effects.
No.
But when the doctor saw that, they thought, hey, it's doing what it's supposed to be doing.
Ah. So now we stop
So
or whatever.
we have, and one of my blue mass stories involves Abraham Lincoln. Before he was elected president, he was involved in a series of debates with others besides Stephen Douglas. At one of these debates, he had been experiencing depression, and his doctor had given him these to take. And they caused tremendous mood swings in Lincoln. And at one of these debates, I don't know who his opponent was, but it was reported that the man had said something that infuriated Lincoln, and he grabs the man by his collar and lifts him from the stage, so his feet are dangling in the air, and begins to shake him. And he realizes, this is not me.
No, that doesn't sound Lincoln.
This is not my normal character. And so he sits the guy down and apologizes to him, but he realizes himself that these must have been responsible for that, and so he quits taking them.
Interesting. So tell me about some of these others. We have
A lot of our medications had their origin, at least, in herbs. Even now, a lot of your things are origin in plants. These are the dried seeds to a poke plant. If you're from around here, you know what poke salad is.
Right.
This is actually the root to the same plant.
Okay.
It's a massive root. But now these were used to actually treat worms in children. Now, they're poisonous, just like the mercury is. They're for a different reason, but they are poisonous. But if you had a child who was showing symptoms of worms, you would give 2, maybe 3 of these for probably 3 days. And just like with the way that the mercury acted and killed the microorganism, these are also toxic to the worms. And so it would kill the worm, and then you stop giving your child this, and your child begins to gain weight and looks normal. These would have been opium.
And that was very common.
Opium was extremely common. There was not a whole lot to be had in that day in the form of pain relief. opium, morphine, they're all plant derived.
Now, when we say opium, do we mean laudanum?
No.
Okay, so that's different.
Laudanum contains opium.
Okay.
Laudanum is a combination of opium and whiskey.
Okay, and laudanum was a very common, prescribed just repeatedly.
Very common. Well, they didn't, just like they didn't understand a lot of things about medicine, they didn't understand the whole idea of addiction. And so that was a totally foreign concept before the Civil War, anyway. And women especially were subject to laudanum addictions because it was given just freely for any kind of thing you would come to the doctor, any kind of complaint. Whether it was to make you be quiet or go away or whatever, I don't know. But it was freely prescribed. These pills would have been made from gum opium. They would have actually been harvested from the poppy itself.
Okay.
Now these also are imitations, but there's a process, and in fact in the South during the war there was an effort to have ladies in their home gardens grow poppies.
How interesting.
And it was for this reason, because of the Union blockades around the Confederacy. It was tough to get medications.
Just like any other supply. And so that was something they thought that they could.
They thought that they could do their own self. Some things they could, some things they couldn't, but they could do some of this.
That is amazing. Now you have, we have a lot of pills. We have a lot of, clearly, medicine that you drink.
Right. Now, something interesting about these, I think that's interesting. Normally medicines were packaged in glass bottles.
Right.
And what's the one thing that happens with glass bottles when you take them across the country?
They break.
And they break. This was the Army's solution to that, because not only were medicines hard to come by and were expensive for the time, and so you come up with a metal bottle. These are actually made out of tin, and they would have had what they call a japanned finish on the outside.
A lacquered.
A lacquered finish. But that way you can drop it, and short of your cork popping out, you're not going to lose your medicine.
So this was actually, the tin from the glass was actually something that was invented, for lack of a better word, during the Civil War in response.
Yeah,
much like, I'm a nurse and I used to work in the operating room, and we had glass bottles for our IV bottles. But since the Vietnam War, those are now plastic bottles, and for much the same reason.
Yeah. One of my favorite things, or a group of my favorite things here, this was one of the practices that you think was just totally barbaric, when you hear about what it was, but it was the whole concept of bleeding a patient. Now,
I think that does make everybody shiver.
It makes everybody cringe just a little bit. I guess that was the start of our modern day phlebotomy, but you would think that that's so far in the past, but it wasn't. In 1860, it was still an accepted practice. And just about all of these instruments here on the left-hand side were all used for bleeding patients. And we'll start with this one, because this is one of the most gruesome things. This is called a phlegm.
Okay.
And during bleeding, a doctor would actually cut the patient and would collect whatever amount of blood he wanted to collect, pretty much. The problem with that was doctors didn't know how much blood you had.
Right.
Now, there were advances over the years. This is probably.
So are these sharp?
These are very sharp.
Okay, those are razor-ish.
These are still razor edges on these, even though it's 200 plus years old. Same with this one. This is a mechanical version of the same thing.
Okay.
And it's spring-loaded.
Ah.
Now, I've never cocked it because I'm always afraid I'll break it, but it would cock into position, and and this is the trigger, and so it would actually give you one cut.
Kind of like a switchblade.
Kind of like a switchblade. These are thumb lances. They were all used for the same purpose.
We say a thumb lance because you held it in your thumb?
You held it between your thumb and your forefinger.
Okay.
These were usually used for opening the veins here in the bends of the arm and the elbow area. The problem with this, like I said, is they didn't know how much blood you had.
Yeah, your total volume.
And ultimately, that is what killed George Washington, was that he was bled by 3 different doctors for an illness over a period of 2 days and lost almost half of his blood volume. Now, these are called bleeding cups. There was dry cupping and wet cupping. Wet cupping involved you being cut first, and then this cup was warmed over a candle and then placed over the incision. And as it cooled, what would happen?
It sucked.
It would create suction, create a vacuum in there, and it would improve or increase that blood flow.
And you couldn't clot.
You couldn't clot because of that. This is a military cup. It's made out of tin, kind of the same thing we talked about the tin bottles.
No glass, tin.
No glass to break. And these would come in sets, normally of about 9 to 12 at a time. But all of this was bleeding, and it was all done. You know, even though you're talking about soldiers, perhaps who had already been wounded, you know, but there were some doctors that would insist on bleeding them further. You know, now this practice stopped before the end of the war for most doctors.
Okay.
There were some that carried on a little bit later, but for most of medicine, it had stopped.
Okay.
We talked about that doctors did not understand germ theory. They thought that if you were sick, we talked about the 4 humors, but that some of these humors could be brought out of balance. They had a word they like to use called miasma. They thought that if you had bad air, if there was a foul odor, that could make you sick. The instruments that doctors used are a good indication that they did not understand germs and microbes. The various handles on these, the dark ones are made from ebony wood, some of these are made from ivory. They're not sterilizable.
They're not. These would hold microorganisms.
Those would hold the microorganisms. Some of these smaller ones here, unlike that one. Now that one is all metal.
Yeah.
There were some things that were metal, but they were not metal so that they could be sterilized.
Right.
That was just the way that they were made.
We autoclave these. Anything that's metal you can autoclave and kill anything that's on it. But it wouldn't kill everything on this.
Right, right. And if a doctor was performing surgery, he may have an apron on, he may just have his vest. And going from patient to patient, he would wipe his instruments, he would wipe his hands. No need to use water, you know, and then go to the next man.
Go to the next one.
Talking about instrument construction, the handles on a lot of these pocket instruments were made from tortoiseshell.
That's what I was going to guess, that was tortoiseshell.
And so that also, you know, being a natural material, is not sterilizable.
Right. And I'm sure that the person who owned these was very proud of the workmanship and that was his tool of the trade.
That was top of the line instruments for this time frame.
Right. And you know, I just noticed that you have a tracheostomy. Oh my goodness, a trach tube. And this is very similar to today's modern trach, where you put this down in the windpipe and you take it out and you can suction to keep it clear. This would enable somebody to breathe. I'm amazed that this is exactly the way they look now, except a different material.
These would have been around in the United States since maybe the early 1850s or so. And so it was pretty well established, you know, at the time of the Civil War. Now this is particularly gruesome.
It is particularly gruesome.
Can you guess what that is?
I can't. It pierces and...
It does. This is a tonsillatome.
That is just exactly what it was kind of starting to come.
Yeah, it's. I get a lot of groans and bad looks from people when we talk about these things, because this would have actually gone down in your mouth.
Yeah. So show it how it does. They would put it in your throat.
And your tonsil
loop your tonsil.
Right, your tonsil would be through there like this, and they would actually skewer your tonsil with this 2-pronged fork. And then
chop it off.
I always have trouble making this work, but this thing has a sliding action, kind of like a guillotine.
Exactly.
And it slices the tonsil. And of course, it's cut free now, but it's on the fork, so you don't swallow your own tonsil and choke on it. But this was, you know, this was the way it was done. And
this was usually done to children.
It was.
And did they chloroform? Did they ether? What did they do?
They would have, yeah. That's one of the things about Civil War surgeries that is a mistaken idea. People think that there were a lot of surgeries done without anesthesia. Maybe they gave them something to bite or gave them whiskey, but they had chloroform and they had ether. Chloroform would have been around since the early 1840s.
Okay,
or so.
and you're right. We do kind of tend to think of Civil War battlefields but not everybody had it all the time, I'm sure.
Well, there's probably less than 0.1% of operations that ever occurred, according to the texts that I read, without chloroform.
Well, that somehow makes me feel better.
It does. It does. Now, this is one of the things the South could not make for themselves.
Okay.
And
so what did they do?
They had a hard time getting it. There was a lot of under-the-table dealings from northern pharmaceutical companies that did sell to the South. There was a lot of chloroform. In fact, there was a lot of medicinal products, whether it was instruments or medicines or whatever, that were captured from Union armies.
Okay.
That were used. A lot of this came south under ladies' petticoats.
How amazing. And you know, I'm sure that they were angels of mercy in the truest sense to bring this.
They were, and at that time, no soldier would have dared ask a lady, what is under your dress?
Right.
And so it was safe.
Yeah.
You knew it was going to get there.
That is amazing that we did have to go with these awful instruments that we know what that's for, that they at least had chloroform.
That they had chloroform. Now, they also had ether. Chloroform was the preferred anesthesia for Southern surgeons especially, because it's not nearly as flammable as ether is.
Okay.
And you're working in a tent, a hospital tent,
right,
or a building, and your main source of light is open flame. And so you're not going to want a high concentration of ether in there.
Right. Now behind us we have a whole nother group of medicines, and you told me a great story about the bandages. I'd love for you to share that.
The bandages, one of the things that women that were left at home were encouraged to do was to support the war effort by having bandage rolling parties. And so there were no more young men in town, so you couldn't have dances and so on and so forth. And so they would have these social events, and they would have something similar to this. And this was like a little handmade item, but it would have rolled your bandages into a nice tight roll.
And I kind of was imagining people sitting around doing what I'm doing here. But
doing it by hand, but most of the time they had a machine that would do that, which made it a tighter roll.
Right.
And then they would pin them together. And once they got enough collected, they would ship them off to the soldiers from their town. I mean, so everybody was responsible for your own people to a large extent.
Right. I didn't realize that. Now, this is something I wanted to be sure that we talked about.
Okay.
This is stained.
That one is stained.
Now, tell us about that.
Bandages, as reprehensible as it sounds to us now, bandages were recycled and were reused. They would have been washed just like your clothes would have been washed in a kettle full of hot or boiling water. It didn't always get the stains out, and they would have been hung on a line behind the hospital to dry, and then they were re-rolled and used again.
But at least they were boiled.
Yeah.
You know, and so that made a huge difference as compared to the doctor's apron that probably didn't never saw boiling water.
Never saw boiling water. Boiling, you know, of course, we know, well, that sterilized them.
Exactly.
And they didn't know that. Along that line of boiling, these are all suture materials.
Okay.
These are cotton sutures.
Okay, so just plain old cotton.
Plain old cotton. This is silk.
And silk is still used today.
Still used today. But neither one of these were the preferred suture material for a Southern surgeon.
Good.
This was the preferred stuff.
This looks like horsehair.
That is horsehair.
Okay.
And you think, how nasty is that to use hair from the tail of a horse? The reason that it was preferred was because to make it take a knot, well, first off, it's readily available.
Right.
When you do sutures, you have to tie knots. For horsehair to hold a knot, it has to be boiled first. So patients that were sutured up with horsehair had less incidence of infection. Well, again, they didn't know why. They just thought
it worked.
It worked better, so this is a better material, and so that was the preferred thing to use.
I worked in the operating room, and all of these, this is exactly what what we still use today. These kind, you know, with the angles and
many
the
of
different
these
sizes
are actually, they still got the razor points.
Yeah, these are
and the
cutting needles.
cutting edges and things on them.
Right.
So there are some things that had not changed.
That's right. This is very similar. And I can see how, what a difference. I mean, they didn't realize that they were killing the germs.
Right.
They were boiling it for a different reason.
Right.
But it worked.
It worked. It worked.
And I know we're getting close on time, but tell us a little bit about the dental things we have here. I know everybody hates to, when you think about this, it hurts, just plain.
We don't even like to go to the dentist now. These are actually period dental pliers. They would have come in a set. There would have been several more in addition to these. The teeth that are represented here.
Oh, and that hurts me just to look.
These are actually teeth that were meant to be replacement teeth.
Okay, I knew these weren't out of somebody's mouth.
They're not out of somebody's mouth.
But they were, so what are they made of?
These are carved from vegetable ivory.
Vegetable ivory?
It's a type of a palm that this comes from. Now, going way back, going back into the early 18th century, it was common practice in England for when people, well-to-do people, especially when they lost their teeth, they would pay a surgeon, because a surgeon did not only doctor, he did the dental, he did everything. They would pay him to find them some new teeth, and he would pay young people so much per tooth, and he would actually remove their healthy tooth and implant it into someone else.
Oh!
It didn't, obviously it didn't last, you know, but for a short period of time, the recipient was happy. And the giver may have been happy because they had money they wouldn't have had otherwise.
Right.
But because those were hard to come by, people started carving them from real ivory, elephant ivory, walrus ivory, and vegetable ivory. And that's what these were made to do. So these are replacements. But they get a good reaction from people.
I'm sure they do. Of all your things here, what is your most favorite piece that you have? Do you have a favorite?
This is probably my favorite of all.
Okay.
This is what would have been called a pocket kit. Now this one, all of the instruments are all original instruments. This also. But this is the only kit that I have that's pretty well complete with what came in it. This was made by a guy by the last name of Arnold, who was an instrument maker in Baltimore.
Okay.
But this would have given a doctor all of the tools he needed at his fingertip to do minor surgeries. And it was made small and compact so that it would actually fit into his coat pocket or his vest pocket.
So it's even kind of downsized from what we think of the doctor's bag.
Yes,
I mean, that really is very compact.
One thing that's interesting to me anyway about these is the size of the finger holes on these scissors. I mean, I've got great big fat fingers, and those are tiny.
It fits me. It does fit me.
And these little forceps, you know, same way.
Right.
So I
these are very small.
Yeah.
So again, we see the difference in the size of people.
But overall, this is my favorite thing here.
This is beautiful. And this has been a wonderful lesson today. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming out. I do appreciate it.
This is Mark Britton. This is History and Heritage. And in case you wanted to get in touch with Mark Britton, the best way to do it would be through Fort Defiance, because that's where we are now. And he is going to be here all day showing folks lots more about Civil War medicine.
We'll talk about everything they want to talk about as far as old medicine.
I love it. This is your history and your heritage.
Hi, this is the Restore. My name is Catherine Norbeck Daly, and I'm the manager here at the Habitat for Humanity Restore. Everything we sell in here is donated. All of the proceeds go to benefit the Habitat for Humanity homes. We take windows, doors, building supplies, cabinets, household goods, and we will pick up. The Restore is located in downtown Clarksville at 408 Madison Street, across from Madison Street United Methodist Church. The phone number is 645-4242. Call us to schedule your next donation pickup.